Hi, welcome to this Corbettmaths video. In this video, we're going to look at the video solutions to the midpoint of fractions practice questions. If you need any extra help finding the midpoint of two fractions, go to corbettmaths.com/contents and scroll down to video number 141A, and there's a video tutorial there on that. Alternatively, you could scan this QR code. But in this video, we're going to focus on the video solutions to the practice questions, so let's get started. So question number one, we've got this number line with 0 and 1, and we've been asked to work out the fraction that is exactly halfway between 1/8 and 5/8. So if we have a look at this number line, it's divided into eighths. So if we start off with 0, we've got 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8, and 4/8 is a half, so that's halfway between 0 and 1. And we've got 5/8, 6/8, 7/8, and 1, which is 8/8. So let's label 1/8 and 5/8 on this number line. So 1/8 would be here, so there would be 1/8, so that's 1/8. And 5/8 would be here, so that's 5/8. And in the middle of those, the fraction that's exactly halfway between those fractions would be this fraction here. And this fraction here is equal to 3/8. So the fraction that is exactly halfway between 1/8 and 5/8 would be 3/8. So let's write that down. 3/8. 3/8. So let's have a look at question number two. So question number two, we've got this number line and we've got 0 and 1, and let's see what we're going up in. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So this is ninths. So that's 0, 1 ninth, 2 ninths, 3 ninths, 4 ninths, 5 ninths, 6 ninths, 7 ninths, 8 ninths, and 9 ninths, which is a whole 1. And we've been asked to find the fraction that is halfway between 2 ninths and 8 ninths. So 2 ninths would be here, that's 2 ninths, so there, 2 ninths. 8 ninths would be here, so that's 8 ninths, and the fraction that is exactly in the middle, halfway between those two fractions, would be this fraction, and this fraction is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ninths, so 5 ninths. So the fraction that is halfway between 2 ninths and 8 ninths would be 5 ninths. So let's write that down, 5 ninths. Okay, let's have a look at question number 3. So question number 3 says, work out the fraction that is halfway between 2/15 and 12/15. So if we wanted to find halfway between two numbers, I tend to add those two numbers together and half it. So for instance, if I wanted to find halfway between 10 and 14, I'd add them together, that's 24, and half it, and that would be 12, and 12 is the midpoint of those two numbers. So likewise with fractions, if we've got two fractions and we want to find the fraction in the middle, or the fraction that's halfway between the two fractions, just add the two fractions together and divide by 2. So let's do that. So 2/15 plus 12/15. Well, what's great here is they've got the same denominator. So 2/15 plus 12/15 would be 14/15. And now we just need to divide by 2. So if we had 14/15 and we divide by 2, well, half of 14/15 would be 7/15. So the answer would be 7/15. And the answer would be 7/15, and that's it. So if we want to find halfway between two fractions, we can just add them together and divide by 2. And this one was quite nice because we had 14/15, half of that would be 7/15, and that's it. So whenever we're dividing a fraction by 2, if the numerator is even, we can just divide the numerator by 2. And I'll talk about what to do whenever the numerator is odd slightly later in the video. Okay, let's have a look at question number 4. So question number 4. Question number 4 says, find the midpoint of 11/20 and 19/20. So again, this is quite nice because they've got the same denominator, so let's just add them together, 11/20 plus 19/20. So we're going to add them together and then divide by 2. So 11/20 plus 19/20, well, that would be 30/20 because 11 plus 19 is equal to 30, so that's 30/20. So that's what we get when we add the two fractions together. Now we just need to divide by 2. So we're going to take our 30/20 and divide by 2. Now it's quite nice because the numerator is even, so we can just half that to get 15/20. Or another way to look at it is if we had 30/20 and we half that, that'll be 15/20, and that's it. So we've got 15/20. Now that does simplify. 15 and 20 are both divisible by 5, so if we divide both of these by 5, we're going to get 3/4. So the answer would be 3/4. So the midpoint of 11/20 and 19/20 is 3/4. And all I've done is I've just added the two fractions together to get 30/20. We've divided that by 2, that's 15/20, and then just cancel down the fraction. Okay, let's look at question number 5. So question number 5 says, work out the fraction that is halfway between 17/50 and 41/50. So we've got our two fractions, let's add them together and half it to find the fraction that's halfway between them. So 17/50 plus 41/50. Well, it's quite nice, they've got the same denominator, so we can just add the numerators. 17 plus 41 is 58, so that's 58/50. Now we just need to divide by 2 to find the midpoint, so 58/50 divided by 2. It's quite nice because the numerator is even, so if we divide 58 by 2 we get 29, so the answer would be 29 fiftieths. And if we halve 58 fiftieths, that'll be 29 fiftieths, and that's it. So the fraction that's halfway between 17 fiftieths and 41 fiftieths would be 29 fiftieths, and that can't be cancelled down, so the answer is 29 fiftieths, and that's it. Okay, let's look at question number 6. Okay, let's have a look at question number 6. So question number 6 says, find the midpoint between 1/5 and 1 2/5. So we've got a mixed number this time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the mixed number into a top-heavy fraction. So if we've got a whole, that's 5/5, and another 2/5 would be 7/5. So we want to change this mixed number to a top-heavy fraction. Now, what I've done is I've just said a whole is 5/5, and another 2/5 would be 7/5. Or another way to think of it is if we do 1 times 5, that's 5, plus 2 is 7, so it's 7/5. So we want to find the midpoint between 1/5 and 7/5, or 1 2/5, which is 7/5. So let's add them together. 1/5 plus 7/5. Well, if we've got 1/5 and we add 7/5, that's 8/5 altogether, so 8/5. Now we need to divide by 2 to find the midpoint. So if we add them together, we then need to half it, so divide by 2. And half of 8/5 would be 4/5, so that would be 4/5, and that's quite nice again because the numerator is even. We can just half it to get 4/5, so 4/5. So halfway between a fifth and 1 2/5 would be 4/5, and that's it. Okay, let's have a look at question number 7. So question number 7 says, find the midpoint between 1/4 and 17/20. So to find the midpoint of two numbers, we add them together and half it. So let's add these two fractions together and then divide by 2. So let's take our two fractions, 1/4 plus 17/20. We're going to add them together and then we'll divide by 2. Now to add these two fractions, they need the same denominator. When we're adding two fractions, they need a common denominator. Now, as you can see here, we've got 4 and 20. Well, the lowest common multiple of 4 and 20 would be 20. So let's keep that one as 17/20. And let's make the first fraction have a denominator of 20. So to get from 4 to 20, we multiply by 5. So 1 times 5 is 5. So 1/4 is the same as 5/20. Now we can just add them. 5/20 plus 17/20 is 22/20. So adding the two fractions together would give us 22/20. Now we just need to divide by 2. So we've got 22/20. We just need to divide it by 2. And half of 22/20 would be 11/20. Just dividing that numerator by 2. Just halving the 22 to get 11. So 11/20. And that's it. So 11/20. So the midpoint of 1/4 and 17/20 would be 11/20. And that's it. Okay, let's look at question number 8. So question number 8 says, find the fraction that is halfway between 2/3 and 4/9. So again, let's add the two fractions together and then divide by 2. So 2/3 plus 4/9. So here the two fractions have got different denominators, so let's make them have the same denominator. So 3 and 9, where the lowest common denominator will be 9. So let's make them both have 9 on the denominator, and let's add them together. Well, 4/9 is just 4/9. That's already got a denominator of 9. Our 2/3, to get from 3 to 9, we multiply by 3. So let's multiply the numerator by 3. 2 times 3 is 6. So 2/3 is the same as 6/9. So we've got 6/9 plus 4/9, that would be 10/9. So if we add these two fractions together, we get 10/9. Now we just need to divide by 2. So 10/9 divided by 2. Well, half of 10/9 would be 5/9. So the answer would be 5/9. So the fraction halfway between 2/3 and 4/9 would be 5/9. And that's it. Okay, let's look at question number 9. So question number 9 says, find the number that is halfway between 4/15 and 2 2/3. Well, let's make 2 2/3 a top-heavy fraction to begin with. So 2, if we're changing it to thirds, would be 6/3, plus another 2/3 would be 8/3. So we've changed 2 2/3 to a top-heavy fraction. Now we want to find the number that's halfway between 4/15 and 2 2/3, or 8/3. So let's add them together. So let's take our 4/15 and add 8/3. So let's find a common denominator. Well, we've got 15 and 3, so let's use 15 and 15 because the lowest common multiple of 15 and 3 would be 15. So 4/15 already has 15 on the denominator. Fantastic. Our 8/3, well, to get from 3 to 15, we multiply by 5. So we need to multiply 8 by 5. 8 times 5 is equal to 40. So 8/3 is the same as 40/15. So let's add the two fractions together. 4/15 plus 40/15 would be 44/15. Now we just need to divide by 2. 44/15 divided by 2. Well, half of 44/15 would be 22/15. So the answer would be 22/15. Now I'm going to change that into a mixed number just because in the question we were given a mixed number rather than a top-heavy fraction. So how many 15s go into 22? That'll be 1, remainder 7. So 1 and 7/15. And that's it. So the number that is halfway between 4/15 and 2 2/3 would be 1 and 17/15. Okay, let's look at question number 10. So let's have a look at question number 10. So let's add them together, a half plus an eighth. So adding them together, well, with the denominators, we've got 2 and 8. So a common denominator would be 8 and 8, because the lowest common multiple of 2 and 8 is 8. Well, 1/8 is already 1/8, that's great. To get from 2 to 8, we would multiply by 4. So multiplying 1 by 4 is 4. So a half is the same as 4/8. Now 4/8 plus an eighth would be equal to 5/8. So if we add these two fractions together, we get 5/8. Now we need to divide by 2. Now we're going to do 5/8 divided by 2. Now this question is a bit different than the ones we've done so far, because all of the questions so far we've had an even number on the numerator and we've just been able to half it. So if we look back at our last question, we had 44/15 and we had divided by 2, so that was 22/15. But in this case we've got 5 and we're not going to half that to get 2.5 and so on. But I just want to show you something. If we had a half and we divided that by 2, well, if we'd half to half, we get a quarter. So that means that if we do a half divided by 2, we get a quarter. If we had a third and we divide that by 2, well, if we had a third and we chop it in half, that's a sixth. So as you notice here, if we've got a fraction where we have got an odd number on the numerator, such as a half or a third, and we divide it by 2, if you're not able to half the numerator, you can just double the denominator. So if we had 7/8 divided by 2, rather than half the numerator, we can just double the denominator. So that would be the same as 7/16. So that would be 7/16. And just to show you that if you had 7/8 and you divide it by 2, which is 2 over 1, remember we can, instead of dividing by 2 over 1, we can multiply by the reciprocal. So that's 7/8 multiplied by a half, and if we do 1 times 7, that's 7, and 8 times 2 is equal to 16. So if we do 7/8 divided by 2, that's the same as doing 7/8 multiplied by half, which is 7/16. So just to show you that if you have an odd number on the numerator, rather than halving it, you can just double the denominator and that will half the fraction for you. So let's do that. So let's go back to our question. So we've got 5/8 divided by 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to double the denominator. So that would be 5/16. And that's it. And just to show you that if we had 5/8 and we divided by 2, which is 2 over 1, remember we can multiply by the reciprocal, so we could do 5/8 multiplied by half, and 5 times 1 is equal to 5, and 8 times 2 is equal to 16. So half of 5/8 would be 5/16. So that means that the fraction that is halfway between a half and an eighth would be 5/16. Okay, let's look at our next question, question number 11. So question number 11 says, find the number that is halfway between 2/3 and 7/8. So again, let's add them together, 2/3 plus 7/8. To get a common denominator, well, 3 and 8, well, the lowest common multiple of 3 and 8 would be 24, so 24 and 24. To get from 3 to 24, we multiply by 8, so 2 times 8 is 16. To get from 8 to 24, we multiply by 3. 3 times 7 is 21. So that means that 2/3 is the same as 16/24. And we've got 7/8, which is the same as 21/24. And let's add them together. 16/24 plus 21/24 would be 37/24. And that's it. So we've added the two fractions together. Now we need to divide by 2. So we've got 37/24, and we're going to divide by 2. Now we can do that in two different ways. We could write it as 2 over 1 and then do the reciprocal and multiply by the reciprocal. Alternatively, we could just, in this case, we can't half the numerator, so let's double the denominator. So the answer would be 37/48. So that means the answer would be 37/48. And just to show you that if we had 37 over 24, and we divide it by 2, which is the same as 2 over 1, we can multiply by the reciprocal, so we get 37 over 24 multiplied by half. 37 times 1 is 37, and 24 times 2 is equal to 48. So we would get the 37/48 no matter which way we do it, whether we multiply by half or whether we just double the denominator. Okay, let's look at our next question, question number 12. Okay, let's look at question number 12. So question number 12 is a calculator question, and this time we've been asked to calculate the midpoint of 19/40 and 5/6. So let's add the two fractions together. So we've got 19/40 plus 5/6. So just type that into your calculator, 19/40 plus 5/6, and that would be equal to 157 120ths. So whenever you add those two fractions on your calculator, you get 157 over 120. Now, if your calculator displays it as a mixed number, it might show it as 137 120ths, but they are equivalent. So it might show it as this, the top every fraction, or it might show it as a mixed number. Mine shows it as top every fraction. So if I added the two fractions together, now we just need to divide by 2. So 157 over 120 divided by 2. And if I just press divide by 2 on my calculator, I get that's equal to 157 over 240. And as you can see, the numerator was even, so we've just doubled the denominator. So that's our answer, 157 over 240, or 157 240ths. So the midpoint of 19/40 And 5/6 would be 157 240ths. Okay, let's look at question number 13. So question number 13 is a non-calculator question, and we've been asked to find the number that is halfway between 3/10 and 3/4. So let's add the two fractions together, 3/10 plus 3/4. Well, let's find the common denominator, and I'm thinking 20, because we can double 10 to get to 20, and we can multiply 4 by 5 to get to 20. So 3/10, well, if we double 10 to get to 20, we double the numerator, so that'll be 6. And to get from 4 to 20, we multiply by 5, so let's multiply the numerator by 5. 3 times 5 is 15. So we've now got 6/20ths plus 15/20ths, which is 21/20ths. So if we added the two fractions together, we now just need to divide by 2. So 21/20ths divided by 2. Now again, we can do that in two different ways. We could do 21 over 20, then divide by 2, which is the same as 2 over 1. Then multiply by the reciprocal, 21 over 20 multiplied by half. 21 times 1 is 21, and 20 times 2 is equal to 40. So that's equal to 21/40ths. Alternative, in this case, because the numerator was odd, I could just double the denominator, so it would be 21 over 40. And that's it. Okay, let's look at our next question, question number 14. So question number 14 is a calculator question. Now it's very important whenever you're doing something like this on your calculator and you're going to add these two fractions together. So we're going to do 3 2/5 plus 6 7/12, that you know where the mixed number button is on your calculator. Now if I have a look at my calculator, I can see just above the fraction button, I've got a rectangle. So it looks like this, a rectangle, and then another rectangle, and a line, and then another rectangle. I've got this mixed number button. Actually, that's shaded in on my calculator. So I've got this mixed number button. So that's the mixed number button. And it's very important you know where that is. So I'm going to press shift, and then I'm going to press the fraction button, and it comes up with a box and then that fraction beside it. So I can type in 3 and then go across and type in 2/5 and then plus, and then I'm going to press shift and press that fraction button again, and I'm going to type in 6 7/12. And I press equals, and my calculator says that's equal to 599/60ths. Now a calculator might show it as a mixed number rather than a top heavy fraction. It could have shown it as 9 59/60ths instead. So it could have displayed your answer as a top heavy fraction or a mixed number, but mine's displayed it as a top heavy fraction. Actually, it could actually show it as a decimal as well. And now we're going to take this number, we've added the two fractions together, the two mixed numbers together, we now need to divide by 2 to find the midpoint. So we're going to do 599 over 60 divided by 2. And it's a calculator question, so we can just press divided by 2 and press equals, and that gives me 599 over 120. Now, because in the question we were given mixed numbers, I'm going to convert my top heavy fraction to a mixed number, and that's equal to 4 and 119 over 120. So the midpoint of 3 2/5 and 6 7/12 is 4 and 119 120ths. Okay, let's have a look at our next question. Question number 15. So question number 15 says, Ryan says the midpoint of 3/20ths and 11/20ths is 7/10. Is Ryan correct? Explain your answer. Well, let's actually find the midpoint of 3/20ths and 11/20ths to begin with. And if we find that midpoint, we might be able to see if he's 1, correct, and 2, if he has made a mistake, we might be able to spot what that is. So 3/20ths plus 11/20ths, well, adding those together would be 14/20ths, just adding the numerators. And now we need to divide by 2, so we've got 14/20ths, and we need to divide that by 2. Now half of 14/20ths would be 7/20ths. So the answer would be 7/20ths. Now Ryan says the midpoint is 7/10, so is Ryan correct? No. And we can just explain the answer is 7/20ths, so no. And that's it. So I've just written no. The correct answer is 7/20ths. Ryan has divided both the numerator and denominator by 2. So whenever he done 14/20ths divided by 2, rather than just having that to get 7/20ths, he's actually divided the 14 by 2 to get 7. But he's also divided the 20 by 2 to get 10. So that's where he's got his 7/10 from. Okay, so let's have a look at question number 16. So question number 16 says, Emily and Neela think of two different fractions. The midpoint of the two fractions is 2/3. So this time we're told what the midpoint is. And Emily says her fraction is a half. So Emily's fraction is a half. And then we're asked, what fraction is Neela thinking of? Now in this question, I'm going to show you two different approaches to this question because you may use one or the other. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do this question in a similar manner to the ones we've done so far, but just work backwards. So normally what we would do is if we had Emily's fraction and Neela's fraction, we would add them together and then divide by 2, and that would give us the midpoint. So that means that if we have the midpoint, we can then multiply that by 2 to find out what the two fractions will add together to give us, and then take away the one we know to find the other one. So let's do that. So the midpoint is 2/3. So let's take our 2/3 and let's multiply that by 2 to begin with. So if we had 2/3 and we double it, that would be 4/3. to double 2 thirds would be 4 thirds. And remember that we could write 2 as 2 over 1, multiplying the numerators. 2 times 2 is equal to 4, and 3 times 1 is equal to 3. So we can either do it like that, where we write our 2 as 2 over 1 and just multiply the numerators into the denominators. Alternatively, you can just double 2 thirds to get 4 thirds. So that means that Emily's fraction and Neela's fraction must add together to be 4 thirds. So let's take Emily's fraction away from 4 thirds to see what Neela's fraction would be. So let's do 4 thirds take away a half. So 4 thirds take away a half. Well, a common denominator, well, we've got 3 and 2. Well, if we had 3 and 2, the lowest common multiple of 3 and 2 would be 6. So let's write 6 and 6 and take away. To get from 3 to 6, we double it. So doubling 4 would be 8. And to get from 2 to 6, we multiply by 3. 3 times 1 is 3. So we've got 8 sixths take away 3 sixths, and 8 sixths take away 3 sixths would be 5 sixths. So that means that Neela's fraction must be 5 sixths. And you can test that. If you added those two fractions together, you would get 4 thirds. And then if you half that, you will get 2 thirds, which is the midpoint of the two fractions. So what fraction was Neela thinking of? The answer is 5 sixths. So that's one approach. Now let's look at another approach. And before we look at this other approach, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to choose two people, Alan and Bob. So Alan and Bob. And I'm going to say that Alan's number is 10. And I'm going to say that we don't know Bob's number, but the midpoint of Alan's number and Bob's number is 13. If we wanted to find Bob's number, well, we could use that first approach that we looked at before, where we double the midpoint, which is 26, and then take away 10, which would be 16. So Bob's number is 16. So that's one way we could find it. Another approach would be to say, well, if we know what the midpoint is, which is 13, if we do 13 take away 10, so to find out how far below the midpoint Alan's number is, which is 3, and if Alan's number is 3 below the midpoint, that means that Bob's number must be 3 above the midpoint, and 13 plus 3 is 16. So that's another approach we could use, but obviously in this question we're going to be dealing with fractions. So let's do that. So let's work out the difference between the midpoint and the fraction we know. So the midpoint is 2 thirds, and the fraction we've been given is a half. Now the midpoint is bigger than this fraction. 2 thirds is bigger than a half. So we're going to do 2 thirds take away a half. So let's do that. So let's do 2 thirds take away a half. And if we've got 2 thirds and a half, let's take them away. So if we've got 3 and 2, the common denominator that we could use, or a common denominator we could use, would be 6, because the lowest common multiple of 3 and 2 is 6. To get from 3 to 6, we multiply by 2. 2 times 2 is 4. To get from 2 to 6, we multiply by 3. 1 times 3 is 3. And 4 sixths take away 3 sixths would be 1 sixth. So that means that Emily's fraction is a sixth below the midpoint. So that means that Neela's number must be a sixth above the midpoint. So let's work out what that would be. So if we had the midpoint, which is 2 thirds, and we add the 1 sixth, we will be able to find out what Neela's fraction is. So let's add these two fractions, but let's look at the denominators. We've got 3 and 6, and the lowest common multiple of 3 and 6 would be 6, so 6 and 6 and plus. To get from 3 to 6, we double, we multiply by 2, so 2 times 2 is equal to 4. And this fraction will already had 6 on the denominator, so let's leave the numerator as 1. And 4 sixths plus 1 sixth would be equal to 5 sixths, and that's it. So Neela's fraction is 5 sixths, and that's it, 5 sixths. Okay, let's have a look at our next question. So question number 17. Otis and Cleo think of two different fractions, and the midpoint of the two fractions is 1 and 5/8, and Otis says his fraction is 9/10. What fraction is Cleo thinking of? So again, we've got two different approaches we could use. We could double the midpoint and then just take away one of the fractions, and it'll tell us what the other fraction would be. Alternatively, we could work out the difference between the midpoint and one of the fractions, and then either add it onto the midpoint or take it away from the midpoint, depending on whether Cleo's fraction is the one that's above the midpoint or the one that's below the midpoint. So let's do both approaches now. So the first approach is to double the midpoint. So let's change this into a top-heavy fraction. If we had 1 and 5/8, well, 1 is 8/8 plus 5/8 would be equal to 13/8. So 1 and 5/8 is 13/8. Now we need to double that, so we want to double the midpoint. So 13/8 multiplied by 2. If we double 13/8, that would be 26/8. And this is actually a calculator question, so we could have done 13/8 multiplied by 2, and my calculator says 13 quarters. And actually, if we simplify this, you would get 13 quarters, or even as a mixed number, it might display it as 3 1/4. So whenever we double the midpoint of the two fractions, we'll either get 13 quarters or 3 1/4. So that's double the midpoint. So that's what Otis's fraction and Cleo's fraction will add together to give us. So if we just take Otis's fraction away from double the midpoint, so if we do 13 quarters subtract 9/10, then that will give us what Cleo's fraction is. So let's do that. And the answer is equal to 47/20. So that means that Cleo's fraction is 47/20. We can actually change that to a mixed number. So how many 20s go into 40? That would be 2, remainder 7, and the denominator is still 20. So that means it's thinking of 2 and 7/20, or 47/20. And that's it. So to do that question, what we done was normally to find the midpoint of two fractions, we add them together and divide by 2. So we multiplied the midpoint by 2 to begin with, and we took away one of the fractions, and we found the answer to be 2 and 7/20, or 47/20. Okay, let's have a look at our other approach. Okay, so our other approach is to actually work out the difference between Otis's fraction and the midpoint, and work out what that is. And then what we can do is we can either add that or take it away from the midpoint to find what Cleo's fraction would be. So if we have a look here, the midpoint is above Otis's fraction. It's bigger than Otis's fraction because the midpoint is 1 5/8, and that's bigger than 9/10 because 9/10 is below 1 and 1 5/8 is obviously above 1. So if we do the midpoint, which is 1 5/8, and we subtract 9/10, that would tell us the difference between Otis's fraction and the midpoint. So that would be equal to 29/40. So that means that Otis's fraction is 29/40 below the midpoint. So that means that if we add 29/40 to the midpoint, that will tell us what Cleo's fraction is, because obviously Otis's fraction must be the same amount below the midpoint than what Cleo's number is above the midpoint. So let's take the midpoint, which is 1 5/8, and let's add the difference between them, which is 29/40, so 29/40, and see what we get. And that's equal to 47/20, or as a mixed number 2 and 7/20, and that's it. So Cleo was thinking of 2 and 7/20. Okay, let's look at our next question, question number 18. Okay, let's look at our next question, question number 18. So question number 18, we've been given some fractions. We've been given the fractions a half, 3/10, 5/21, 2/5, 4/9, and 1/3, and we've been asked to find the median. So to work out the median, we're going to arrange the fractions in order from the smallest to the largest, and then we're going to find the middle one. And because there's 6 fractions, the middle one will actually be the midpoint of 2 fractions, and that's probably why it's in this worksheet. So let's arrange them in order to begin with. Now, we could find a common denominator here, but with 2, 10, 21, 5, 9, and 3, I don't want to find the lowest common multiple of all of those numbers because it could be quite large. What I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to consider the fractions as decimals, and then I'm going to put them in order that way because it's an uncalculated question. So a half is 0.5, 3/10 is 0.3, 5/21, well, I don't know that one off by heart, so I'll just leave that one for the moment. 2/5, well, that's equal to 0.4. 4/9 is equal to 0.444, and so on. And you can just use your bus shelter method to get that if you want to. You could do 4 divided by 9 and you just do a decimal point and some zeros. And how many 9s go into 4? That's 0, remainder 4. How many 9s go into 40? So that would be 4, because 4 9s is 36, remainder 4. How many 9s go into 40? 4, remainder 4, and so on. So that's 0.4 reoccurring, or 0.44444, and so on. A third, you should know that one off by heart. That's 0.3333, and so on. So the only one left is our 5/21. Now, as you can see here, this is 5/21. I think that's going to be close to 5/20, and 5/20, if you cancel it down, is a quarter, which is 0.25. So I think this one's actually going to be 0.2 something or other. I think it's going to be our lowest fraction out of all of these, so it's definitely not going to be involved with our finding the midpoint for our median. But let's actually just check that. So we're going to do 5 divided by 21. So 5 divided, so that's 5.000, and so on, and we're going to divide that by 21, and we just want to find out, is this number our smallest number, because that'll be quite useful to know. So how many 21s go into 5? 0, remainder 5. How many 21s go into 50? So 21 plus another 21 is 42, plus another 21 is 63. So as you can see, how many 21s go into 50? It'd be 1, 2, so 2, remainder 8. So it's 0.2 something or other, so 0.2 something. Now, as you can see, that means that that is going to be our smallest fraction. So that's great. We can now put our fractions in order. So let's put our fractions in order. So our smallest fraction is our 5/21 there, so we've done that one. Now we've got our 0.3, which is 3/10. So we've done that one. We've now got our third, which is 0.33333, and so on. So we've done that one. Next, we've got a choice of 0.5, 0.4, 0.444. So that's going to be our next smallest, will be 2/5. Then we've got our 4/9, and finally our biggest fraction is a half. So that's our fractions put in order. Now we want to find our median, which would be the value in here, in between a third and 2/5. So we need to find the midpoint of a third and 2/5. So let's work out the midpoint of those two fractions. So to find the midpoint of these two fractions, I'm going to add them together and half it. So let's do a third plus 2/5. So looking at the denominators, we've got 3 and 5, and the lowest common multiple of 3 and 5 is 15. So we've got 15 and 15. To get from 3 to 15, we multiply by 5. 1 times 5 is 5. And to get from 5 to 15, we multiply by 3. 2 times 3 is 6. And adding these two fractions together, 5/16 plus 6/15 would be 11/15. So that will be the two middle fractions added together. We now need to divide by 2 to find the midpoint, which is then the median. So we're going to do 15ths divided by 2. Now here, because the numerator is odd, we can just double the denominator, so it'll be 11/30ths, and that's it, so it'll be 11/30ths. Alternatively, we could have done 11 over 15 divided by 2, which is 2 over 1, that's 11 over 15 times by a half, and then multiplying the numerator and the denominator together will be 11/30ths, and that's it. So the median is 11/30ths. Okay, let's look at our last question. Okay, question number 19. So question number 19 says x is the midpoint of 1 2/5 and 3/10. And then we're told the midpoint of x and y is 2/3, and we've been asked to find the value of y. So let's start off with this first statement, this first bit of information at the top. X is the midpoint of 1 2/5 and 3/10. So let's find the midpoint of these two fractions, or this mixed number of fractions to begin with. So let's add them together. So that would be 1 2/5. Let's change that to the top every fraction. 1 times 5 is 5, plus 2 is 7, so that's 7/5, or there's 5/5 in 1, and another 2/5 would be 7/5. And we're going to add 3/10, and then we'll add those two together and then half it. So let's add these together. Well, we want to get a common denominator to begin with, and if we've got 5 and 10, a common denominator that I can think of would be 10 and 10. So to get from 5 to 10, we double it. So doubling 7 is 14, and then 3/10 is just 3/10. And adding the two fractions together, 14/10 plus 3/10 would be 17/10. So if we add these two together, we get 17/10. Now we want to divide by 2 to find the midpoint, which is x. So 17/10 divided by 2 would be equal to, well, the numerator is odd, so we can just double the denominator, so that'll be 17/20. And again, we could have done divided by 2 over 1, which is the same as multiplying by a half, and then that would give us 17/20. So that means that x is 17/20. X is 17/20. Now we're told the midpoint of x and y is 2/3. So that means that if we add together x and y, and we get that answer, and then we divide by 2, we get an answer of 2/3. So let's take the midpoint, which is the 2/3, and let's double it, and then take away x, and we'll be left with y. So let's take our 2/3, and let's multiply by 2. So that's going to be 2/3 times 2, which is 2 over 1. 2 times 2 is 4, and 3 times 1 is equal to 3. So double this midpoint is 4/3. Now what we're going to do is, well, we know that x and y will add together to give us 4/3. So if we take away x from this 4/3, we'll be left with y. So we need to do 4/3 take away 17/20. So we're nearly there. We've got 4/3 take away 17/20. So let's find a common denominator. Well, 3 and 20, I'm thinking 60 and 60. And to get from 3 to 60, we multiply by 20. So 4 times 20 would be 80. So 4/3 is the same as 80/60. And to get from 20 to 60, we multiply by 3. 3 times 17 is 51. So now we just need to do 80/60 take away 51/60, and then that will be the value for y. 80 take away 51 is 29, and then our denominator will stay the same, so it's 60. So that means that y must be 29/60, and that's it. Y is 29/60. And that's it. So these have been the video solutions to the midpoint of fractions practice questions. If you need any extra help on this topic, if you go to corbettmaths.com/contents and scroll down to video number 141A, there's a video tutorial there on how to find the midpoint of two fractions. Alternatively, you could scan this QR code. And again, I really hope you found this video useful. And if you have found it useful, please like it and please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you. Cheers. Bye.